Hello, welcome to my office hours. I hope everyone's had a good week. My really little one had an earache this week, so our week was rather stressful. She turned 1 and had the earache on the same day, and we did not sleep very much that night at all. But other things have been much better, so that's good. So I've got a lot of questions this week, so I'm going to dive right into them. The first question is from Cecily. And she wrote, my question is, I noticed that the publisher agents had specific genres they were looking for. What if I have written in a different genre? Most of what I write is suspense, but the project I am working on right now is general fiction. It's not a romance, it's a love story. So if I'm understanding the genre, it's general fiction, or would I be wrong? So there's several questions here, and I hope I'm understanding all of them correctly, Cecily, and feel free to correct me if I'm not. But the first question is that you notice that the publishers and agents have specific genres they're looking for, and what if you write in a different genre? Do not submit to these agents. Agents really specialize. They have an area of interest that's usually quite narrow, and that's where they place the books. So publishing is such a large industry that it's not possible for anyone to know everything about it. And so the agents that specialize in a genre, say science fiction, they would know all of the science fiction publishers. They would know the ins and outs. They would have contacts with all of these publishers, and they would be able to place you with the right publisher. And they would be able to place you with the right marketing for that sort of thing if you needed an outside source for that. And all of their knowledge would be specialized in this area. So what a lot of people do is they just submit to whatever agents look the best, but you really need an agent that fits your genre and that understands how that genre works. It is one of the most important factors, actually. And it's interesting because you talk about not romance, but it's a love story. That really depends on the interpretation of the agent too. And I think in general, if the main theme is romance or love, and there's no like secondary themes that are very strong, it is generally sort of grouped into romance, even if you don't want it to be. So that is something to take into consideration. But as for general fiction, agents that are looking for it will often say mass market fiction or something like women's fiction. Words like that are used sometimes instead of just general fiction. It's funny because when you go to the bookstore, there's just a general fiction section, but a lot of the books in that section are actually from other genres, like post-apocalypse now and things like that. So that's all worth taking into consideration. Cecily says, makes sense. My answer makes sense. But what do writers do that write in multiple genres? You have multiple agents. Sorry, I should have mentioned that earlier. But actually, it's really common if you're outside of more than one genre for you to have more than one agent or different agents at different times. Lots of writers don't stick with the same agent for their whole career. And if an agent does really mesh well with you and they work really well with you on one genre, they might consider going into another, and they might and you might let them, but you might not, because sometimes they wouldn't be the best fit for it, especially if it's like a huge like a really different market. For example, suspense is often grouped in with general fiction, so that might not be as much of a stretch for an agent to handle both of these things. I hope that helps. So hi, Nancy. I see that you're there now. And I'm just about to answer your question. Nancy Curtis asks, aside from the addressee line, is there any difference in query letters for agent versus publisher? And this is a good question. There are two major differences. Agents are definitely more interested in comparative titles, which is titles of books that are much like your own. And one of the really big mistakes a lot of people seem to make with comparative titles is they choose books that are very much like what they're writing, but that are older books. And so comparative titles should really be published within the last 2 years, no longer than that. And some agents even specify within the last year. I've even seen it say 6 months, but really a year is 2 years. It's a good general marker. So recently published books that are like your own. And publishers sometimes want to see comparative titles, but it's not as important. And those comparative titles can be much older in the case of publishers. So you can say to them, oh, my book's very much like Narnia, but an agent does not want to hear that. So the other thing that a publisher wants that an agent doesn't is actually market analysis. And this depends on the publisher. Some of them want it, some of them don't, but a lot of them do want it. And it's more and more that they want this information. And especially important when you're submitting to a publisher versus an agent is you should really talk more about your own marketing platform and any potential you have there. So I hope that answers that question, Nancy. So Mark asks, a publisher asks me if I own the rights to all the books in the series, and is it an acceptable practice to send them a follow-up? Because they asked him, he said, whatever he said, probably that he owns all the rights. And then they didn't respond for a very long time. So unless the answer you sent them was that you don't own the rights, which might be why they didn't pursue it, what you should do is you should follow up as long as it's been at least 3 months. Usually I say query after 6, but if they've sent this initial, question to you after seeing your books, then you should definitely do a follow-up, because these are serious and things do slip through the cracks. It's really overwhelming. They have lots of options, and it's good to check. It really is. Within a reasonable amount of time, of course. Veronica asks, what about heavy subject matters? Are they good to write about in novels? Like, is it worth writing about a heavy subject matter in a novel? And how should they be balanced? So this is a really interesting question and a really good one. And I think that it is very important to talk about heavy subject matters in novels. I mean, it's one of the only places we can talk about heavy subject matter. It's much easier than talking about it with one's friends sometimes. And it's really a good way to go in depth in a way that a movie doesn't. And a lot of people find reading about these things are cathartic. A lot of bestsellers have been about really heavy subject matters, like Tuesdays with Morrie and Still Alice. There's like very important things that have been discussed in books first before going on to becoming movies. And sometimes they're just discussed best in the books. I think that's true with Still Alice. It's really hard. I think it's really important to write about them, but it can actually be pretty hard to write about them. And I think the best way to figure out how to balance difficult subject matter is to read books that qualify. So Still Alice would be a good example. Close Your Eyes and Hold Hands by Chris Bogin. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his last name correctly. There's a lot of letters in there. Would be a good one to look into. Things like A Fine Balance by Rohinton Mystery. Like, there's lots of books about heavy subject matters that have done really well. So look into them, read them, see which ones you like and which ones you don't, and see which ones really work. Like, one of my favorite books about a heavy subject matter is probably I think it's called not The Accidental Marriage, The First Marriage. I'm confusing The Accidental Tourist by Ann Tyler with whatever I'm trying to think about. But it is about a heavy subject matter. It is about a husband losing his wife and then figuring out that their marriage was actually not that great and moving on. And it's actually a very funny and engaging book. And I will look it up afterwards and put it in the titles there. Yeah, I think find the heavy subject matter books you like. Find out what the author does, how they add humor, how they add balance. One of the other ways that people really add balance is that if it's about a character going through a really hard time, they put that character in a really good relationship, either with a friend or a romantic relationship, and that helps balance it because it adds this levity and this support, which is important. Kevin asks, are we going to continue having access to the lessons, like the ones that I've uploaded on Thinkific? And I know that you will for at least a couple months. We don't know exactly how it will work because Thinkific has some control over things in the long term, but it should be there at least until August. And you should have free access to that. And I think one of the interesting things is, for this office hours at least, is the new students for my summer course can actually be listening to this now because the group has actually grown, the Facebook group at least. And we've started to add in the next students for the summer class, which starts on June 24th. And yeah, so I'm excited about this. This is my first class, and then my second class is coming. A little intimidating, a lot exciting. So yeah, welcome maybe. The other question Kevin asks, and they will have, this new class will have a slightly different course based on feedback. And so they don't have to see all your comments, and so you don't have to see theirs. So each class will work that way. Kevin asks about what is a fair contract, and I do talk a lot about this in the final week. And there's definitely lots of nuances that I don't fully understand because I'm not a lawyer. But there's certain net ratios that you should expect in terms of royalty, and I talk about this in the final week. And also, it has to do with rights, like international rights, national rights. It's best not to sign over international rights. It's best not to sign over things for like movies, all that sort of stuff. You should never sign a contract that doesn't have a time limit. Most are 3 to 5 years. Those are the big red flags, but there's a great list on Writers Beware that lists all of the red flags you should be looking for. And I highly suggest that you look at it. It is linked to in the lesson that really focuses on the contract. So I wanted to answer, Nancy mentioned to Cecily that some of the agents I have researched handled multiple genres, and that is true. But the more genres an agent handles, usually the worse sign it is. You really want an agent, generally, there are some exceptions, they are pretty few and far between, that specializes. And there's certain genres where this is even more important than others. For example, that's really important in children's literature and in science fiction, in my experience. So do keep that in mind, that it's not always a good sign if an agent is open to a lot of different genres. So Winston says, so the lesson on vetting publishers and agents seems to lean heavily on what to watch out for and what to avoid. How can you give us the lay of the land on agents? How many are out there? How many come and go in years, other time periods if applicable, and how many rep literary fiction? So I wish there was really solid numbers to throw at you. There isn't. There's a lot listed on Agent Query, and they'll tell you how many, but it really depends. One of the reasons the lessons on vetting publishers and agents seems to lean heavily on what to watch out for and what to avoid is because once you've eliminated a lot of agents, the remaining agents are in fact good ones. And the same goes for publishers. Like, the more you know in terms of eliminating them, you're leaving the wheat, you're eliminating the chaff. So that's why I focus on that. And I don't really know what you mean by, can you give us the lay of the land on agents? Because that's such a broad question. I really think that you should look for ones with specific focus, which I've already talked about. And one of the things that I think is the most important is I've never submitted to an agent where I haven't read at least one of the books by an author that they've represented, because then I know if that author has things in common with my writing. I know if, sometimes you could just like even download a Kindle sample of that book, just so you have a good impression on really what they're looking for and what the authors they actually represent write like. So I think that's one of the important things, is to really know what those authors are like that they represent. There's thousands of agents out there. There's a lot of them. Most work in larger agencies. Agencies can have, usually, like a larger agency can have like 2 to 10 to 15 agents. And agents in larger agencies are more likely to have other people read their slush piles initially. So like the general submissions. other people will read them, and then the agent itself. Like when I was talking to an agent at a conference, they said, well, when you submit it to me, say, attention, I've met with agent name, and she requested this specifically. And she said, only that way will it get past the slush pile and to her directly. So that's the problem, is you're not actually, especially with these larger agents, submitting it to someone who is going to see your work necessarily. So do keep that in mind. I think agents, if they're good, they tend to stick around for a long time, 25, 30 years plus. I think most agencies, if they're not working, or agents, fold within 2 to 3 years. So it's good to look for an agent that's been around for more than 3 years. And that's good too, because it takes about 3 years to get a book out with one of your authors. Like, these things take time. So they have to have that. Like, I would never sign with an agent who has not had previous experience with other writers, because they're unproven. And I get a lot of emails from them asking for my help. So that makes me particularly leery at Authors Publish. And as far as how many rep literary fiction, it's not a priority for a lot of agents. There are some really good ones that specialize in it. And, you know, there's still probably hundreds that represent literary fiction, but there's also a lot of literary presses that are open to direct submissions, less than there used to be, but still most of the big ones like McSweeney's still allow it. And even ones like Coffee House Press, which is not as big as McSweeney's, but very established and has excellent distribution. They have open reading periods every year, usually twice. So it's really worth looking into those things, because you're applying to the same slush pile that you would be at an agent, probably actually at an agency, probably actually a better slush pile. So it's worth taking into consideration. I hope I answered all of your questions there. Yeah, and like Nancy said, there's thousands of agents on Query Tracker, but I would never, and I really can't stress this enough, would never submit to an agent that I didn't then verify on Absolute Rights. Not all the agents and agencies are there, but if they are there, make sure you check. And you can, for a long time, their index was really intimidating to me and just far too long and hard to navigate, but you can just use the find function on your computer to find the name of the agency or the name of the agent that you're looking for. And there it is. And you can click on the link and you can follow through. And it's really helpful because it also tells you about response times. Like, often agents are updated, like the information on them in threads is updated much more frequently than information on publishers. So usually response times are very accurate there. Rejection rates are very accurate there. And like Nancy said, Query Tracker is a great resource. There's a reason I bring it up a bunch. It's very helpful in terms of navigating this sort of thing. Cecily asks, what did you call it? I'm assuming she's talking about Absolute Right and their water cooler. I linked to it on many occasions, but it's just a website that's a forum. Well, the whole website is called Absolute Rights. And then the forum is what I think is the most helpful. And it has author feedback on publishers and agents. And it's really a great place to troubleshoot things and to verify any questions you might have. Yeah, Jacob typed up the link. Thank you. So it's 8:50. These usually go 30 minutes, and I like to answer any additional questions that might have come through. Okay, well, I'm really glad for the questions I got. I thought they were all very thoughtful and helpful, and I really like this class, and I can't believe next week is going to be our last week. I feel a little sad about it. I guess that's it. I hope you have a really great week, and thank you so much.